Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and this is Red Lines. My guest today is Beirut-based journalist Laith Marouf. Welcome to Red Lines, Laith.
Thank you for having me, Anya.
Let's begin by discussing the latest reports you're seeing now that the ceasefire has been in place. What's actually happening on the ground in Palestine? Of course, the fight does not end.
Well, there is now currently a revenge pogrom of Palestinian citizens of apartheid Israel. The authorities are going house to house, picking up people in their cars. Any Palestinian citizen that was involved in the demonstrations and the uprising in the ghettos of 1948 is being rounded up. The numbers are huge. There's more than 1,000 of those Palestinian citizens of apartheid Israel that have already been rounded up. There's hundreds also in Jerusalem and in the West Bank that are being arrested. We're talking about the numbers reaching over 1,400 in total. It is overwhelming the lawyers that are trying to defend these people in courts. And we have to remember that Netanyahu reactivated the British military laws that existed before 1948 to try those Palestinians, citizens of apartheid Israel, under these martial laws, basically. So this is happening. Also, we saw in both Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, two of the Palestinian ghettos in Jerusalem, being targeted heavily by apartheid troops, beatings of demonstrators that were coming yesterday to support the residents of Sheikh Jarrah. Today, there was an attack on the Silwan neighborhood, also the ghetto there. A lot of the houses are slated there for eviction. They have a court appearance on Wednesday in Silwan. So this is in general the repression and revenge that the Zionist authorities are trying to vet on the Palestinians for daring to humiliate them in the battle that happened last month, in the last few weeks. And also right now in Gaza, there is a total blackout of the electricity. The authorities Israeli authorities are not allowing the fixing of all the infrastructure that was destroyed, not allowing parts to come in, and they are not allowing gas for the generation of electricity. And things are on the edge. At any moment, it's very clear that things could escalate again.
Which brings me to my next question, Laith, because this latest war, this assault on Gaza was spurred by provocations Israel made in Jerusalem against Palestinians in, as you mentioned, Sheikh Jarrah, also at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So will this ceasefire hold if Israel's continuing this type of behavior?
It's very doubtful. The formula that the resistance was trying to institute, the new parameters of engagement with the apartheid state, is that an attack on any Palestinian anywhere, including in Jerusalem, will entail a response from Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but also anywhere across all of historic Palestine. So that's the parameters that the resistance is trying to set. And as we see, apartheid Israel is trying to assert that these parameters are not active right now. Just half an hour ago, there was a big funeral for some of the fighters that died in Gaza, pushing against the possible invasion and attacks by apartheid Israel. And some of the leaders of the resistance groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas were out in person, in public, and one of them clearly stated that if apartheid Israel doesn't retreat from what it's doing right now, that they will be back fighting, this oppression. So The signals have been given. We saw also the head of the Israeli army ordering readiness of all the troops and ordering his intelligence to rebuild the bank of targets. So it's clear that things are on the edge, and nothing has been solved from the original problem that led us here.
And give listeners and viewers more context to that point you just brought up, the fact that with this war, Hamas has really expanded what it considers to be its right to respond and ability to respond. How was this war different in terms of defining the capabilities and the right of Palestinian resistance?
Yes, so as I said, this is the first time that the resistance groups in Gaza decide to use their military power to defend Palestinians in other parts of Palestine. So now that there is a clear change in rules of engagement. And, what that means is that the weapons of the resistance in Gaza can actually defend somebody in Haifa. We saw their missiles reach there. It can defend Palestinians that are being oppressed in Jerusalem. And that is unacceptable to the apartheid regime because it had disarmed the West Bank resistance. It has a collaborating class in the West Bank and a collaborating security system, authorities that have been trained by General Dalton of the United States that are targeting anybody that could carry arm in the West Bank. So therefore, having the Gaza military force being able to defend Palestinians on any of the territory of historic Palestine, that is a huge change in the parameters of the engagement between the parties. And what we will see in the next few days and few weeks and months is if these parameters become a fact on the ground, and will apartheid Israel fight nail and tooth to make sure that doesn't happen.
How did Israel feel this war differently than those in the past?
Well, the quality and quantity of missiles that the resistance in Gaza launched on apartheid Israel are totally different than any other engagement. And you have to remember that in previous attacks on Gaza, the Palestinian resistance shelled just the envelope around it of colonies. And this time, all of historic Palestine was under its bombardment. There was a lot of guided, targeted missile hits that destroyed most of the main infrastructure in apartheid Israel. And we're talking here about the main port, second most important port, and the Ashkelon port destroyed, targeted the main two airports and almost all the bases in the south and east of historic Palestine have been targeted. Added to the fact that there was multiple attacks by cornets. Those are the guided missiles that are used against tanks. On the first day of the military engagement at 6 p.m. When they fired their first shots from Gaza, one of them was a Cornet missile that hit a pickup truck carrying the commander in the apartheid army that is in charge of all communication gathering in Gaza, and two of his sergeants were liquidated with him. At the time, also, they were trying to move tanks into the Gaza envelope. And, before, when the first truck carrying a tank was 10 somewhat kilometers away from Gaza, was hit by a cornet. So that meant that the apartheid army couldn't even bring its tanks. This image that we used to have in previous wars with Gaza of hundreds of tanks parked on the perimeter of it, we didn't see that. They were all in hiding. And there was many special weapons that surprised everybody, used by the resistance in Gaza, including drone submarines that hit the gas installations in the Mediterranean, blew them all up to bits. And so there's a lot of change in the tactics of the resistance. They targeted all the infrastructure and main military installations of the enemy. And in return, all that apartheid Israel could target was, as we saw, residential buildings and high-risers to terrorize the Palestinian population in Gaza.
And did all of this mean that Hamas had more of a hand in dictating the terms of the ceasefire this time around? What were the considerations, do you think, the Israeli government and Netanyahu himself had to make when deciding to step back this time?
Yeah, I mean, look, there was no real negotiations of a truce. We saw a unilateral, unconditional truce called by apartheid Israel before any agreement from the resistance, and that includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the PLFP, all those who are active militarily in Gaza. And this is a very significant development because it meant it was a tacit admittance of defeat by Israel. And for the resistance, if you remember, the enemy, the apartheid Israel, declared the ceasefire to start at 2 a.m., and that was announced around midnight here. And the response of the resistance was that they have a plan ready to carpet bomb all of apartheid Israel from north to south with hundreds and thousands of missiles simultaneously. And that if apartheid Israel doesn't cease the attacks on Gaza immediately, that they will fire it. And that's what happened. But within minutes of this announcement by the resistance, all the bombardment, aerial and ground and naval bombardment of Gaza ceased an hour and a half before the deadline of 2 a.m. So it's a clear defeat for the enemy. There's no way out right now. We can see the deterioration of the authority and power projection of apartheid Israel accelerating.
How did this war signal a realignment in terms of where Hamas falls in terms of allies in the region? There was a time when it was courting more support from Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood type or led countries, Turkey as well. And now it feels really to be a part of what it always more naturally fit with, which is the resistance axis. So I'm wondering if you can explain, first of all, what is the resistance axis and how Hamas has now fully become a part of it, plain for everyone to see.
So yeah, the resistance axis is basically Iran, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, with it the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the resistance in Iraq, the Ansarullah in Yemen. So these are the major parts of the resistance axis. Prior to the Arab Autumn, Syria was the cornerstone of this resistance axis, and it hosted all the Palestinian resistance groups, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And unfortunately, Hamas, at the beginning of this Arab Autumn, in my opinion, got deceived and didn't calculate correctly, and thought that with the Muslim Brotherhood taking over many of the countries that had the Arab Autumn activities happen in them, that it has a new center of power that can aid it, headed by Qatar and Turkey. And of course, what we saw is, on the one hand, Egypt under Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, actually never opened the gates of Gaza, continued the blockade, of Gaza. And the other, this miscalculation that Hamas had led it to think that the government in Syria was going to collapse under the weight of the NATO 70-somewhat country coalition that was going to destroy it. And they aligned themselves with some of the factions that were fighting against the Syrian government. And unfortunately, that included they transferred some of the knowledge of tunnel building and digging that both the Syrian government and Hezbollah transferred to them and taught them and trained them on. And so the Syrian government, when it crushed the opposition that's backed by the Americans, it never forgot that betrayal by Hamas. One of the most important things in building alliances in axes like this of resisting imperial pressure is to be able to trust and stand by your ally no matter what. And that situation, pushed Hamas, made it isolated. We saw how it was targeted in 2014 and 2018, and no one came to its aid. But in the last year and a half, especially since the assassination of Soleimani, we saw Hamas coming out publicly, declaring Soleimani the general of the head of the Al-Quds brigades of the Iranian Guard as the martyr of Palestine. They came out and thanked publicly the Syrian government, President Assad, Hezbollah, for transferring the cornets to Gaza from the personal stockpile of the Syrian government, paid for and delivered for free, delivered by Soleimani, the martyr of Palestine. So we have a rapprochement happening. Just the day before the ceasefire was declared, there was a delegation of all these Palestinian groups that visited President Assad of Syria, and with them was a minor member of Hamas as an opening to start the rapprochement. So we're expecting some of Hamas's leadership to arrive in Damascus in the next few days after the election, the presidential elections in Syria, to kind of smooth the situation and apologize officially.
I'm wondering what you think about a trend that I notice in the West, and although you're in Beirut, I'm sure you're plugged in enough to notice it as well, which is a tendency by people who consider themselves progressive or left-wing to pay lip service to the Palestinian cause, say that they stand with Palestine, but then immediately denounce Hamas and say Hamas doesn't actually represent the Palestinian people. They're not a fair representation of the desires and the will of the people of Palestine. How do you respond to people who take that line?
Well, first off, I want to personally say that I'm not a member of Hamas. I'm not a member of any political party. My personal preference is to a secular movements or secular states. But, Hamas was democratically elected. Ismail Haniyeh, who's the head of Hamas right now, was democratically elected as the Prime Minister of Palestine. The election that the United States, was what do you call it? There was people that were watching the elections that happened there, including President Carter, which called it the democratic election. And as a result of those elections, the West punished the Palestinian people, especially the ones that are living in Gaza, and enacted the siege now that is in its 13th year. Starving the population for that democratic choice. So it's not the place of anyone who is not Palestinian to tell the Palestinians who should represent them or how they should represent themselves. And in fact, it's not the place of anyone who's not Palestinian to tell Palestinians how to resist their oppressor, to resist the colonization and the imperial project of apartheid Israel. So, whatever criticism I may have for Hamas for their political positions or their directions. The minute they carry arms against apartheid Israel, I'll be right behind them there and every Palestinian. And this is what happened in this last 10, 11-day war. Every Palestinian across historic Palestine stood with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, no matter what their political leanings are. And the leadership, the puppet regime of Abbas and in the West Bank is now more irrelevant than ever.
That's exactly the next question I had for you. We've been talking about the leadership in Gaza. Where does all of this leave Abbas? Where was he in any of this struggle, this latest struggle? And what, I mean, you say he's irrelevant. That answers most of my question, but give viewers more of an understanding of what role he plays in what is considered Palestinian leadership.
So, currently, because of what happened, we saw many Palestinians in the West Bank pushing for an armed confrontation with the occupation in the West Bank ghettos. Of course, the only thing that was standing in their way was the security forces of the Palestinian Authority, the colonial construct that is led by Mahmoud Abbas. To show you how irrelevant he is right now in the whole Palestinian scene, the Palestinians of 1948 who have no leadership in terms of organized parties and so forth, they are more relevant to what's happening right now in Palestine than the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and any of his goons. At one point during the war on Gaza, this last one, the youth wing of the Fatah party, which led by Mahmoud Abbas, published a statement condemning Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority and the language that they were using in their speeches or presentations about what's happening. They said that the language and the behavior of Mahmoud Abbas is unbecoming of Palestinians and their struggle, and unbecoming of Fatah and its historical record. And so that shows you that Fatah lost control of its youth wing. And that's basically half of the membership of any party in Palestine is the youth. And the other very significant thing that happened was the Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is one of the main militias, armed militias of Fatah, headed by Marwan Barouti, who's the POW in Israeli jails, the Nelson Mandela of Palestine, who were supposed to have been disbanded after the Second Intifada, actually came out to the streets of the West Bank, fully armed, parading, and issued statements that saying that they have been in the secret formation for years because of their fears being targeted by the security authorities of the Palestinian Authority, the security forces of the Palestinian Authority. And they paraded in Ramallah, the fiefdom of Abbas, basically. And so here we have the armed militia of Fatah basically breaking away, and their youth wing breaking away. So what is he there left to represent but collaboration? And his forces, as I said earlier in the interview, are going house to house in the West Bank and rounding up anybody that was seen with a weapon and or organizing the demonstrations against an invasion by the occupation forces.
And this is just after Abbas delayed elections, presumably out of insecurity.
Yes, I mean, it was very clear that in any coming election, especially that Marwan Barouti put his name on a ticket separate from Fatah, that Marwan Barouti was going to be elected as the next president, and most probably a member of Hamas was going to be the next prime minister. So that would have threw him in the dustbin. Abbas and all his collaborating class would have been pushed away. And so things have been, the timing played out with all these events. Part of it is you can see clearly that all the tools of control that apartheid Israel has over Palestinians, including military force, are deteriorating. And the way that apartheid Israel and its tools like Mahmoud Abbas are responding to this reality is by acting in vengeful ways, and because they can't believe that they're losing power. So, nobody with a complete sane mind would invade Al-Aqsa Mosque with militarized forces in the middle of Ramadan, at the last 10 days, the holiest days of the Muslim calendar, and attempt to crush the worshippers, to bring in Jewish supremacist colonists to walk over their heads in the Aqsa Mosque. That's the behavior of somebody who has lost their ability to actually analyze reality correctly.
Something which really struck me over the last few weeks were the images we saw in Jordan of thousands of Palestinians marching to the border and desiring to enter, to return, go back and see the West Bank. What is the significance, do you think, of those images during this time?
I mean, I think they were some of the most significant images of anything that happened outside Palestine. And I want you to, and our listeners to remember that just weeks before this, there was an attempted coup by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi authorities in Jordan. They tried to take out the King of Jordan and replace him with his half-brother. And ultimately, the reason behind that was that the King of Jordan was refusing for years now the deal of the century, the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords and the normalization, was refusing them. And so both MBS and Netanyahu wanted to remove this king and install his half-brother in, and then the invasion of Jerusalem would have happened of Al-Aqsa Mosque by these troops. The new king would have declared that he has lost or abdicated his custodianship of the holy sites in Jerusalem to the Saud family, and then the Saud family would have come in and made a deal that favors apartheid Israel. So that was the plot. So luckily, the authorities in Jordan were able to nip it in the bud. And so what we saw of the hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating across Jordan in Amman every day in front of besieging the consulate, the embassy of apartheid Israel, and then the daily demonstrations at the border with the West Bank in the Jordan Valley, those were all actually authorized and supported by the government of Jordan. In fact, when the crowds breached the wall between the two sides of the Jordan River and walked through, to the West Bank and burnt an Israeli military outpost, and actually walked for tens of kilometers and reached the Palestinian villages that are isolated in the Jordan Valley. That was a clear indication that there's, because the authorities in apartheid Israel didn't even dare shoot at these demonstrators. You know what they do on the other side in Lebanon, there was 2 civilians that were assassinated, killed by apartheid Israel when they got close to the border. But they didn't dare do that. They didn't even dare do that when these demonstrators burnt the outpost, the military outpost. So the situation is very significant in Jordan, and it shows that if actually Jordan decides to fully break away, which is a big if, from American influence, that front with the West Bank is going to be hell for apartheid Israel.
And what does all of this say, what you've broken down over the last several minutes, the strength and the growth of the resistance in Gaza, the jeopardy the Palestinian Authority finds itself in the West Bank, the strengthening of an armed resistance there, perhaps, and a political leadership more aligned with Hamas rising in the West Bank, and the situation in Jordan, the winding down of the war against Syria. What does all of this mean for the future of Palestine and the reality of perhaps something like a one-state solution, or for Israel to be put more on the defensive in the future?
I think this is the beginning of the end for apartheid Israel. Look, if we calculate, Gaza is just 20 somewhat kilometers by 7 kilometers. It's a city with its suburbs. That's what Gaza is. And it was able to, on the one hand, sustain itself under bombardment for 11 days and beat the hell out of apartheid Israel, destroying most of its infrastructure in the south and the east. So you could imagine what would it mean if the whole resistance axis was at war with apartheid Israel. Not even, let's even just imagine Hezbollah getting to war with apartheid Israel today. What would this mean? We look at, there was a drone that crossed from over Jordanian airspace into the area of North Palestine called Bisan and was shot down by the Israelis, and Netanyahu held it in front of the cameras, part of the wing, claiming it's an Iranian Qasif 2 drone. That came in flying from Jordan or Syria, from Iraq or Syria. So that was, hours before the ceasefire was signaled. The Leviathan gas field, which is the biggest gas field that the Israelis are siphoning off from the waters of Palestine, blew up, and that's 130 kilometers away from the coast of Haifa, 300 somewhat kilometers from the coast of Gaza. So clearly a missile was thrown at it from somewhere else, not from Gaza. So all of these were signals of readiness by the resistance axis to join in any battle. And I think all of these signals actually hastened the surrender of the Israelis, this ceasefire from one side. And only their lunacy and their supremacy is not allowing them to acknowledge these realities, and we see them right now doing what they're doing to the Palestinian citizens of apartheid Israel, where we started in this conversation, and the targeting of people in Gaza, in Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods, and so forth. Those are, clear indication that they didn't learn their lesson, and they will have to learn it the hard way once more.
I wanted to close by giving you the opportunity to respond and analyze some of the international media coverage, particularly in the West, which you've, I know, paid close attention to, particularly that coming out of the CBC in Canada.
Yes, I mean, it was a disaster, I think, how the Western media covered Palestine this time around. And I don't mean a disaster for the Palestinians. It was a disaster for them. You see, on the one hand, the Palestinians were able to defeat the media empires of the West and even defeat the social media empires and their algorithms and censorship. Although thousands and thousands of accounts of Palestinians were shut down permanently on Facebook and Instagram. One of them is mine, by the way. They're not even allowing me to download my 14 years of content on Facebook. So although that happened, the Palestinians were still able to send their message globally and defeat these empires. And this led to all the media apparatuses in the West to practically centralize any coverage of Palestine in the hands of a few to be able to fully censor it, and we saw that happen in Canada. Hundreds of journalists signed this open letter saying their newsrooms in print, in radio, and television have all now centralized any coverage of Palestine, and they're living extreme censorship. This happened in the CBC specifically, where all the reports about Palestine were handed the power of decision-making to two individuals within the CBC who are Zionists, who are supporters of apartheid Israel. Many journalists and anchors actually produced segments that were never allowed to air on CBC. One of these anchors that I spoke to had produced a segment of 14 minutes for his daily show. At the end of the news show, there's a 14-minute interview with a Palestinian Canadian professor, and these censors took that segment and gave him back a segment of 2 minutes, and he refused to air it himself and withdrew his labor. So this is happening. If this is happening in CBC and it's happening in all the newsrooms in Canada, it's clear that it's also happening in all the newsrooms in the West. And everybody knows that. People who are watching, people who have read the stories of these censorship and these protests by these journalists, which means that the empire is willing to burn the credibility of all of its media outlets rather than allow one truthful voice of Palestine to come out. Similar with the social media platform. They're willing to burn the utility, destroy the social media utility, just to silence Palestine, even if it means other people will open social media accounts on a platform that is not controlled by the US. And so these are all actually suicidal decisions, and they indicate that the imperial order and the cornerstone of apartheid Israel within this imperial order is falling apart, and they can't believe it is happening right in front of their eyes.
Yeah, just look at the example of the Associated Press, where they actually fired a reporter over activism in college, in university, that she was considered too pro-Palestine, and yet was not even as outraged about its own offices getting bombed, Israel bombing and targeting its offices in Gaza. I think that comparison just says everything about the mindset of those media organizations. And I agree with you that it's to their detriment, not to ours. We're going to continue to seek alternative information. There are great other sources. Press TV was incredible to watch throughout these last several weeks out of Iran, just putting even Al Jazeera to shame and making it look like the BBC. So there is an alternative rising, and of course you're part of that as well, Laith. Where can viewers follow you and see your information? I guess you're always being taken off Facebook, but you at least for now still have a Twitter.
Yes, I'm on Twitter. It's my name, LaithMarouf. Lost that Facebook account. Definitely what you said about the change in how people are consuming the media, that the space that Grayzone and others that are creating, that is make it impossible to, for them to put this wall of silence. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope we can, all this work that you're doing will have fruitful results.
Well, we'll continue the conversation in the future. And again, I encourage everyone to follow Laith. Thank you so much.